a year and a half ago. Senator Ayotte, it's good to have you here. So many of us, knew that the end was coming, but John McCain was such a fixture on the national scene, 6 terms in the U.S. Senate. It's hard to believe he's gone.
It really is. It's a very, very sad day. He was a dear friend of mine, and, I served on the Armed Services Committee with him. He was the chair of that committee, and, his devotion to our military, his leadership, his courage, we all know of his sacrifice, not only in Vietnam, but his whole family served. His son served in the military, and he's just an incredible example of an extraordinary person who's lived his life with courage, loved this country, a great patriot, and it's a huge loss for us.
He spent 6 years, almost 6 years, as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, was tortured there very badly in the Hanoi Hilton, 3 years in solitary confinement. It nearly cost him the use of his arms. He was severely crippled as a result of the torture that he endured there and the aircraft shoot down that resulted in his capture. And yet at the same time, he was one of those who pushed to end the embargo on Vietnam in the 1990s. I think that says an awful lot about the forgiveness that was in his heart and, well, just the fact that he was able to move on from a terrible experience.
Yeah, I had the privilege of traveling to Vietnam with him, and I can tell you that the way he is received now by the Vietnamese people is incredible. Think about what he went through there, the sacrifice that he made for our country. He was asked to go home. He said no. The fortitude that took, what it took for him to stay there when he's being tortured. He's just the courage that he showed. He showed that throughout his life, but it also, I think, it made him very appreciative of life and very appreciative of people. He always stood up for people's human rights and their dignity. And that was something I think that was very important to him, and probably going back to his experience as a prisoner of war. And you think about what it took to be able to survive through that. He every day he got up with that kind of grit and fortitude, and every issue he approached it with that kind of determination.
I know he had served for some time in the Senate when you arrived there. Was he one of those who gave you any advice about what it's like to work in that institution?
Yes, he did, because as I said, I served on the Armed Services Committee with him. He was the chairman of that committee, and such a strong voice for our country on national security and for our military. And yeah, he gave me advice, and it was always really straight. He always said, I'll tell you, and I saw him this year when he was ill, and you know what he told me? He said, do the right thing. He's like, that will work out, and even if people disagree with you, you got to do what you think is right in your heart. And he never strayed away from a fight. He said, if you believe in something, you got to stand up for it, and you got to fight for it.
Let me read a statement from the Republican National Committee on his passing. They write, "We mourn the passing of a true American patriot, Senator John McCain." This is from the chairwoman, Ronna McDaniel. Senator McCain dedicated his life to serving his country both during his time in Congress and in combat in the U.S. Navy. He was an advocate for American leadership in the world and a tireless champion of our nation's troops and veterans. We at the RNC are praying for the entire McCain family at this difficult time. There are many in Washington who talk about veterans, who talk about the troops, but there aren't that many who have lived that life and experienced frontline combat the way Senator McCain did.
Yeah, first of all, I think he's a one-of-a-kind, extraordinary, just an extraordinary leader. He leaves a tremendous legacy, and he not only, talked the talk, but he really walked the walk when it came to our veterans. I traveled with him to many war-torn areas, and there wasn't, wherever there was a troop, John would go and visit them, their families. When he ran for president, he would meet regularly with the families of those who were killed in Iraq and other conflicts. And he used to carry on, he would wear a bracelet with the name of a soldier who was killed from New Hampshire in the line of duty, and that's how much it meant to him. It really, to his core, he's a patriot, and the military and their families were very important to him.
He was, of course, a two-time presidential candidate, lost the Republican nomination to the man who went on to become president, George W. Bush, then ran again in 2008 and competed and for a time was leading in the race against Barack Obama, the senator at the time from Illinois. Barack Obama has just released this statement, and let me read it for you now. John McCain and I were members of different generations, came from completely different backgrounds, and competed at the highest level of politics. But we shared, for all our differences, a fidelity to something higher, the ideals for which generations of Americans and immigrants alike have fought, marched, and sacrificed. We saw our political battles even as a privilege, something noble, an opportunity to serve as stewards of those high ideals at home and to advance them around the world. We saw this country as a place where anything is possible, and citizenship is our patriotic obligation to ensure it forever remains that way. Few of us have been tested the way John once was, or required to show the kind of courage that he did, but all of us can aspire to the courage that put the greater good above our own. At John's best, he showed us what that means, and for that we are all in his debt. Michelle and I send our most heartfelt condolences to Cindy and their family. Once again, that's the statement from former President Barack Obama. John McCain, after he lost that race to then Senator Obama, was pretty gracious in in defeat. It was a hard-fought campaign, Senator, and perhaps you can shed a little light on that.
Well, what I can say is, and of course, coming from New Hampshire, John came back twice to win the New Hampshire primary when people thought that his campaign was over. So he really had a special relationship with my state when it came to presidential politics. And I will tell you that for John, it's the kind of dignity that he had. After he lost that campaign, he wanted to bring the country together and heal the country. And, it's tough. I can imagine losing a presidential campaign and putting your heart into it, but John thought it was more important to bring people together, and that is the type of leader that he was.
Kelly Ayotte, former senator from New Hampshire. Senator Ayotte, it's good to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
We just had some of the video of Senator John McCain up. Ed Henry's still with us. Ed's spent a long time in Washington covering various branches of our government, including the Senate. Interesting there to see Senator Joe Lieberman there behind McCain. They were very close, different parties, but very close.
I remember being at the Republican convention in St. Paul in 2008, and Joe Lieberman, as a Democrat, very nearly became the vice presidential nominee. John McCain, in later years, said he regretted not picking him. There was concern among his brain trust that as a pro-choice Democrat who had been on the ticket, of course, with Al Gore just 8 years earlier in 2000, that he would lose the conservative base. And John McCain, frankly, felt, I should have rolled the dice. I lost anyway. I listened to all the smart people about what I should have done, woulda, coulda, shoulda. I'm also thinking about, I covered that 2008 campaign on the McCain side. And you're absolutely right that he was gracious, because in the final days of that campaign, I remember a moment, and I believe it was in Wisconsin, but it was in the Midwest. And you have these candidates and they're tired and they know they're likely to lose in the final days, and when they're on the losing end of it, and they might do multiple events and they're tired and they're worn out. And someone talked to him at a town hall and started disparaging Barack Obama and questioning his nationality. And maybe another candidate who was losing and thought maybe this would help him in the polls might have piled on. But John McCain said, no. He's an American, and I just have a disagreement. And he has a good family. He's a good family man. I just have a disagreement on policy. I just have a different vision of America. I recall him generally saying that. And it was a brave, courageous moment for John McCain to, amid all of these rumors and attacks and everything else, to say, no, Barack Obama's a good man. I just have a disagreement with him. And I think he brought that warrior spirit. And when you hear Senator Ayotte talk about him going back, and she served with him in the Senate, I remember when he came back in 2009 to the Senate, and I and others asked him, did you think about retiring? Did you think about walking away? Some people in defeat would say, heck with it. I'm going to go back to the ranch in Arizona. And you mentioned his lifetime of service. He served America for 60 years, going back not just to the Senate, but his military service. He had a grandfather, Admiral John McCain Sr., a 1906 Naval Academy graduate, and his father, also a Navy admiral, Admiral John McCain Jr., earned the Silver Star during World War II. And John McCain said something to me about how both his father and grandfather, when they retired from the Navy, died very quickly. They no longer had a mission. They no longer had a vocation. And he wanted to stay in the fight, and that's why he kept running again. Some in the conservative base felt like he had abandoned them, didn't like him in later years, felt like, the Obamacare vote that he split with President Trump on. There were some tense moments, but he wanted to go back to the Senate and fight for his principles.
There is a destroyer, the John McCain, prowling the Pacific right now that is named after his father and his grandfather as well. A ship that is quite a thing to behold.
Yeah, and his mother is still alive, Roberta McCain, 106 years old.
Wow.
And Lindsey Graham tells the story that a few years ago, I believe in her 90s or right around 100 years old, against her son's wishes, she went on a European vacation and wanted to rent a car. And I don't know if it's Hertz or Alamo, I don't want to disparage the company, but this is according to Lindsey Graham, and he'll tell the story, I'm sure, when he comes on. Lindsey Graham says that Roberta McCain tried to rent a car, and they said, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're too old. That basically we have rules and liability and all of that. You can't rent the car. And she wanted to take this car through various countries around Europe against her son's wishes and others' wishes. And she finally turned to the rental car person and said, how much is the car? They got her a price and she said, I'm buying it. And so she bought the car and traveled around Europe with that car. So my point is that John McCain, and we got to know Meghan McCain really well here at Fox, Cindy McCain, the entire family, these are people who I think are strong, and he's had a tough battle, a tough fight in recent months, and you wonder, where does Meghan McCain, where does John McCain get that toughness, that spunk? Yes, his father and grandfather, Navy admirals, but his mother, who's still alive, 106, pretty tough woman as well.
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Frank Donatelli is joining us now. He was senior campaign advisor to John McCain. Frank, tell us about that experience. I'm sorry.
That was right. That was 2008. And then I moved over to the Republican National Committee to be Senator McCain's person at the RNC for the last 6 months of the campaign. Well, the campaign lasted almost 2 years, and I think we were ahead for 10 days. But Senator McCain was the happy warrior always working very, very hard. I think the one thing I remember was from early in the campaign. This was when President Bush had announced the surge to try to save the American effort in Iraq, and everybody was walking away from that. Not McCain. He doubled down and supported the Bush surge, and he would give speeches across the country. And basically what he said was, I don't mind losing an election, but I don't want America to ever lose a war. And that's how he began the campaign, and that's the way he brought his candidacy to the American people, and it's how he conducted himself always.
He came into political office during the Reagan Revolution, but it's my understanding that he actually opposed President Reagan's plan to send the Marines to Lebanon because he felt like they were too few in number and would not be able to, amount to anything as a fighting force. And, given what later happened at the Marine barracks, it was a very prescient observation.
Yes, well, he did. That was his position, and he turned out to be correct. I think in retrospect, that's exactly what happened. The Marines were sort of holed up in a barracks, and they had no mission besides just keeping the warring factions apart. And we had the terrible blast that killed over 250 Marines. But again, I think that's John McCain, even his good friend Ronald Reagan, somebody he admired, he was willing to stand up and speak about, especially national security issues, if it was something that he believed in very strongly.
Ed Henry was just telling us the story about how Senator McCain felt that his father and grandfather both died early and too young once they left the service because, you know, they sort of didn't have a mission anymore.
Right.
That's Ed's story, not mine, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. His time in public service, did that energize him? Did that prolong him?
Well, you know, I think the really fascinating thing about Senator McCain is he had the ability never to look back. So he obviously had a lot of setbacks in life. His time being a prisoner of war, being treated so brutally, as some of your colleagues were talking about, and yet when he's in the Senate 20 years later, he's able to put all that aside and support President Clinton in normalizing relations with Vietnam because he felt it was in the national interest. And if you had to encapsulate what he believed, it came in the second campaign, 2008. The title of the campaign was Country First. I mean, you can disagree. He disagreed with members of his own party, but it was never nefarious and it was never for poor reasons. It was always because he honestly believed that the stand he was taking was in the best interest of the United States, and that was always his touchstone.
Frank Donatelli. Frank, it's good to have your memories tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Grant Woods is joining us. He was Attorney General in Arizona in the 1990s, but also was Chief of Staff to John McCain when he was a congressman. Grant, thanks for being here tonight.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
When he spent 2 terms as a member of Congress before moving on to the Senate. Did you know that this man was going to have the kind of political career that ultimately he had? 6 terms in the Senate and 2 runs for president?
Well, you know, I think from pretty much day one, our goal was to get John to the Senate. He belonged there. It was foremost on our mind. So I think that was our early goal. And you know, when I first met John McCain, right after he moved here to Arizona, I'm a native Arizonan. You know, I, like everybody else, I was like, who is this guy? He's just moving here and he's going to run for Congress. And I met him and I walked out of the meeting and immediately thought, wow, this guy is amazing. And I was for him and thought, yeah, he could go all the way, not just the United States Senate, but wherever he wanted to go.
Let's talk a little bit about what happens now. It's my understanding that under Arizona law, the person who replaces him will be appointed by the governor, and that person has to be a Republican. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's what our law says.
And so that his term will expire in 2022. So another 4 years for whomever the governor chooses.
Well, I think the way the law reads is the governor will appoint, and that person will serve until the next election. There's not enough time for this election, so that means that seat will come up in 2020. And I gather, I guess it would be for 2 years, and then they'd have to run again. So that's what we're looking at. So it'll be a governor's appointment within the same party to go to the next regular election, which would be 2020.
So there are going to be 2 new senators from the state of Arizona. Jeff Flake is retiring. John McCain has now passed away as of this evening. There are some who say that this could be an opportunity for a Democratic pickup. Do you see that?
Yeah, I definitely see that. I think that's a very real possibility as far as the Jeff Flake seat. I think they have an excellent candidate, and you know, we'll see who the Republicans nominate on Tuesday. So I think that's a real possibility.
It's been a long time since Arizona was represented by a Democrat, but I guess you know, we'll see what the election brings.
Right, we've elected